The July sun was a merciless hammer over downtown Chicago. For Nina, 7 months pregnant and a world away from her old life, the city blurred into a shimmering haze. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the concrete sidewalk seeming to tilt and sway. Her hand flew to her swollen belly, a protective instinct. Through the swimming mirage of heat and car fumes, she saw it. A familiar black Bentley, sleek as a panther. Inside, the silhouette of her husband, Dominic Vale, was unmistakable. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Then, the world went dark as the car smoothly pulled away from the curb. Dominic Vale felt the lurch in his gut before his brain processed the image. Nina. It was undeniably her. Her hair, once a cascade of honey-blonde silk, styled by the city's best, was now tied back in a messy bun, tendrils sticking to her sweat-sheened face. The bespoke maternity dress he'd bought her from a Parisian boutique was gone, replaced by a simple, faded floral sundress stretched taut over her prominent belly. But it was her eyes that pierced the tinted glass of his Bentley, wide with shock, then desperation, then a hollowing emptiness, just as she crumpled to the pavement. "Mr. Vale, is everything all right?" Mr. Takada, the Japanese real estate magnate Dominic had been courting for 6 months, asked from the seat beside him. His voice was polite but sharp, missing nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through Dominic. This was the final meeting, the culmination of a year's work to secure the lakefront development deal that would cement his legacy. The Takadas were old school, valuing honor, stability, and image above all else. What would they think if they knew the disheveled, fainting woman on the sidewalk was his wife? The wife he'd told them was spending the summer at their European villa. The lie had been so easy. His entire life was a carefully constructed facade, and he was its master architect. "Driver, go," Dominic said, his voice a low, steady command that betrayed none of the war raging within him. "Sir?" The driver, a new hire named Peterson, glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed with concern. He had seen her, too. "I said, go," Dominic repeated, his tone dropping to ice. He turned to Mr. Takada, forcing a seamless, charming smile. "Apologies. A momentary distraction. Chicago's vibrant street life." Mr. Takada nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the spot where Nina had fallen before returning to Dominic. An unreadable expression settled on his face. The car accelerated smoothly, merging into the river of traffic, leaving the scene behind. For a few agonizing seconds, Dominic's neck muscles screamed for him to look back. He fought the urge, focusing instead on the blueprints laid out on the tablet in front of him. Control. It was all about control. He was Dominic Vale. He did not get distracted. He did not fail. But as the Bentley sped toward his gleaming skyscraper, the image of Nina's face was burned onto the back of his eyelids. He hadn't just left a stranger on the street. He had left his pregnant wife, the mother of his unborn child, unconscious on the hot summer pavement. And he had done it to close a deal. The chilling thought settled in his stomach, heavy as lead. It hadn't even been a difficult decision. Nina woke to the smell of antiseptic and the gentle beeping of a machine. A cool hand was on her forehead. She blinked, her vision slowly clearing to reveal a kind, weathered face framed by graying hair. A paramedic. "Easy now, ma'am. You took a bit of a tumble," the man said gently. "You're okay, and baby's heartbeat is strong." Relief washed over her so intensely it felt like a second wave of fainting. She was in an ambulance. Outside, the sounds of the city were muffled. Another man, younger, with kind brown eyes and an apron stained with coffee, stood by the open doors. "I saw you go down," the man in the apron said, wringing his hands. Right outside my cafe. I'm Ben, by the way. You come in for water sometimes." Nina recognized him. Ben's cafe was her one small daily luxury, a cup of ice water and 5 minutes of air conditioning on her break from the bookstore down the street. She tried to sit up, a fresh wave of shame and dizziness hitting her. "Thank you. I'm so sorry to cause a scene." "Don't you dare apologize," Ben said, his voice firm but warm. "The city's no place for a mama-to-be in this heat. The paramedics want to take you in to get checked out, just to be safe." Tears pricked Nina's eyes. The kindness of these strangers was a stark, painful contrast to the image seared into her memory. The black Bentley, the indifferent turn of her husband's head, the deliberate act of driving away. He had seen her. She knew he had. In that split second, she had seen the flicker of recognition in his eyes, followed by a chillingly familiar shudder of cold calculation. He had chosen the deal. He had chosen his image. He had chosen to leave her. The paramedic helped her lie back down. "We'll take you over to Northwestern Memorial, just a precaution." As the ambulance doors closed, blotting out Ben's concerned face, Nina stared at the ceiling, a single tear tracing a path down her temple. It wasn't the fall that hurt. It wasn't the heat or the exhaustion. It was the confirmation of a truth she had been running from for months. She had not just been an inconvenience to Dominic Vale. She had been disposable. And in that moment, something inside her, something that had clung to a foolish, microscopic sliver of hope, finally broke. The love she once felt for him curdled into something new, something hard and cold. It was the feeling of survival. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And for the first time, she was glad. Her child would never know the cold, gilded cage she had so narrowly escaped. She would make sure of it. Just a year ago, fainting on a street would have been an impossibility. Nina's life had been a meticulously curated performance piece, directed by Dominic. Their penthouse on the 85th floor of the Vale Tower had panoramic views of Lake Michigan, a sterile masterpiece of glass, steel, and Italian marble. Her days were scheduled down to the minute. 8 a.m. Pilates with a private instructor, 10 a.m. fittings for charity galas, lunch at Michelin-starred restaurants, afternoons spent on the boards of carefully selected non-profits. Dominic called it maintaining the brand. Nina called it slow suffocation. She had met Dominic at a university fundraiser. She was a bright, ambitious art history graduate, working at a small gallery. He was the charismatic real estate titan, a whirlwind of power and charm. He'd pursued her relentlessly, showering her with a kind of focused, intense attention that felt like sunlight. He loved her intelligence, he'd said, her passion for art, her independent spirit. It was only after the wedding that the sunlight began to cast long, cold shadows. Her independent spirit became something to be managed. Her job at the gallery was deemed unfitting. Her friends from college were unsophisticated. Her opinions on art were amusing anecdotes for his business dinners, but her opinions on his life or business were met with a condescending smile and a gentle, "Leave the strategy to me, darling." The power imbalance was a chasm between them. He held all the cards, the money, the social standing, the key to their apartment. She was a beautiful accessory, her value directly tied to her compliance and her reflection on him. He wasn't physically cruel, but his control was a boa constrictor, tightening so gradually she barely noticed until she could no longer breathe. He chose her clothes, vetted her calls, and curated her life until she no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. The pregnancy was her breaking point. She'd hoped, with a desperate, foolish optimism, that a child would change him, soften him. She remembered the moment she told him. They were in their cavernous living room, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. "Dominic, I'm pregnant," she'd said, her hands trembling as she held up the positive test. He didn't rush to her. He didn't kiss her or whoop with joy. He stood by the window, his back to her for a long moment. Then he turned, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. It wasn't the smile of a happy father-to-be. It was the smile of a king who had just secured his dynasty. "A Vale heir," he'd said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Excellent. We'll need to adjust your public schedule. Announce it in Forbes. This is good for the brand." There was no us, no our baby. There was the Vale heir and the brand. In that moment, Nina knew this child would not be a person to him, but an asset. Another piece on his chessboard. She envisioned her son or daughter growing up in this sterile penthouse, taught that love was transactional, that people were tools, and that image was everything. The thought terrified her more than anything else. That night, she lay awake, listening to his even breathing beside her in their king-sized bed. The decision, when it finally crystallized, was terrifying but liberating. 2 weeks later, while he was on a business trip to Singapore, she acted. She didn't take the diamonds or the designer bags. She packed a single duffel bag with her old, pre-Dominic clothes, the few books she'd managed to keep, and all the cash she had in her personal account, a paltry $7,000, a monthly allowance he provided. She took a cab to a gritty, anonymous part of the city, found a small, dingy apartment for rent, and paid 3 months in advance with cash. She sold the last piece of jewelry Dominic had given her, a simple gold locket, for a few $100s. She bought a cheap, untraceable burner phone. She became Nina Ellis again, not Nina Vale. The first few weeks were a blur of fear and adrenaline. Every siren made her jump. Every well-dressed man on the street looked like one of Dominic's security team. But slowly, a new reality set in. It was a life of counting pennies, of eating ramen noodles, of sore feet from a job stocking shelves at a second-hand bookstore. But it was hers. The air in her tiny apartment, which smelled of dust and her neighbor's cooking, felt cleaner and easier to breathe than the climate-controlled, scent-diffused air of the penthouse. For the first time in years, Nina felt the quiet, thrilling hum of her own agency. She was building a life, not for a brand, but for her child. Nina's world shrank to a 5-block radius, but her spirit expanded in inverse proportion. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building, with creaky stairs and questionable plumbing. The single window looked out onto a brick wall. Yet, waking up to the sound of her own alarm clock, not the hushed movements of a housekeeper, felt like a victory. Her job at Bound Again, the second-hand bookstore, was a haven. The owner, a perpetually flustered man named Leon, cared only that she was reliable and knew the alphabet. She spent her days surrounded by the comforting scent of old paper and ink, her hands dusty from forgotten histories and discarded adventures. Her swollen belly made shelving the lower books a challenge, but her co-workers, a sarcastic grad student named Zoe and a retired librarian named Helen, were always there to help, no questions asked. They didn't know her past, and for that, she was grateful. To them, she was just Nina, the quiet, pregnant woman with a sad, far-off look in her eyes sometimes. The heart of her new neighborhood was Ben's cafe. After her fainting spell, Ben had become a quiet guardian angel. He'd press a pastry into her hand with her cup of water, refusing payment. "For the little one," he'd say with a gruff smile. He was a widower in his late 40s, his own life etched with a quiet sorrow that he channeled into kindness. He never pried, but his cafe became her sanctuary. One afternoon, sitting at her usual small table by the window, Her friend Jade found her. Jade was the one friend from her old life who had seen through the facade. A fiery, no-nonsense journalist, she had despised Dominic from the start. "I've been trying your old number for weeks, Elle," Jade said, sliding into the chair opposite her, her eyes scanning Nina's worn-out dress and the tired lines around her eyes. "I was about to file a missing persons report. Then I got your text from this burner." Nina managed a weak smile. "Sorry, I had to unplug." "Unplug?" "Nina, you fell off the face of the earth," Jade said, her voice a mixture of relief and frustration. She reached across the table and squeezed Nina's hand. "Are you okay? Really?" Tears welled in Nina's eyes, and the whole story came tumbling out. The suffocation, the pregnancy announcement, the escape. She left out the part about fainting on the street and Dominic driving away. It felt too raw, too humiliating to say out loud. Jade listened, her expression hardening with every word. "That son of a bitch! I knew it. I knew he was a monster, wrapped in a cashmere coat." She looked at Nina's belly. "And you've been doing this all alone?" "I'm not alone," Nina said, a surprising strength in her voice. She gestured around the cafe. "Ben gives me free muffins. Helen from the bookstore is knitting the baby a blanket. Zoe is giving me her old bassinet. It's different." Jade studied her friend. The designer glow was gone, replaced by a pale exhaustion. But her eyes, once clouded with a polite, vacant haze, were clear and present. She was thinner, yet more substantial. "You're right," Jade said softly. "It is different. You look more like yourself than you have in years." The conversation turned to logistics. Jade insisted on setting up a secret bank account for her, transferring some of her own savings. "Don't argue," she commanded. "This is what friends do. We're your family now." Later that week, as Nina was organizing a stack of classic paperbacks at the bookstore, she felt a flutter in her belly, then a distinct, firm kick. She gasped, dropping a copy of Great Expectations. She placed both hands on her stomach, her breath catching in her throat as the baby kicked again, a tiny, powerful assertion of life. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. This was real. This tiny life inside her was real. She was no longer just running from Dominic. She was running toward this, toward a future she would build with her own 2 hands, a future rich in ways Dominic Vale could never comprehend. She had no fortune, no status, no power. But sitting on the dusty floor of a second-hand bookstore, she felt like the wealthiest woman in the world. Dominic Vale's world was one of meticulous order. His deals closed, his stocks rose, and his image remained flawless. The incident with Nina on the street was a jarring anomaly, a crack in the marble facade of his life. He'd spent the days since trying to seal it with the mortar of denial and deflection. The Takada deal, which should have been a triumphant celebration, felt hollow. The signing had been subdued. Mr. Takada's handshake was firm, but his eyes held a cool, appraising quality that unsettled Dominic. He had the distinct feeling he was being judged, not as a businessman, but as a man. The penthouse, once a symbol of his dominion, felt vast and silent. The silence was an accusation. It echoed in the spaces where Nina's quiet presence used to be. He found himself standing in her walk-in closet, surrounded by rows of exquisite dresses and shoes she had left behind. He ran a hand over a silk gown, the fabric cold and lifeless. He'd bought her these things to make her happy, to make her the perfect partner. Hadn't he given her everything? His older brother Ethan found him there one evening. Ethan Vale was the antithesis of Dominic. He managed the family's old money, the philanthropic foundations, the quiet, respectable side of the Vale dynasty. He saw Dominic's ruthless ambition as a vulgar betrayal of their heritage. "Still no word from her?" Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed. He was the only person Dominic couldn't intimidate. "She'll be back," Dominic said dismissively, turning away from the closet. "She's being dramatic." "Dramatic?" Ethan's voice was laced with scorn. "She's been gone for 2 months, Dominic. She's pregnant with your child, and you've done nothing. You haven't even hired a private investigator. You've just let her vanish, hoping it doesn't upset your business negotiations. The Takada deal is worth $2 billion. It required my full attention," Dominic snapped, his composure finally cracking. "And what is your wife worth?" Ethan shot back, stepping into the room. "I saw the look on your face that day, after you met with them. You were spooked. Something happened. What did you do?" Dominic's jaw tightened. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the city lights. "I'm handling it. By handling it, you mean ignoring it until it becomes a PR problem?" Ethan's voice was relentless. "You see people as assets, Dominic. Liabilities to be managed. You always have. But Nina is not a stock price. She's a person. A wonderful, bright person who you have systematically hollowed out to fit your narrative. And now you're surprised she's gone?" A surge of rage, hot and defensive, rose in Dominic's chest. "You know nothing about my marriage. I know I saw my brother turn into a cold, calculating machine who values a building more than his own family. Dad would be ashamed. The mention of their father was a low blow, and it landed. Their father had been a formidable but fair man, a builder of things, yes, but a builder of family first." Dominic flinched. "Get out, Ethan," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Ethan sighed, the anger draining from him, replaced by a weary sadness. "Find her, Dominic. Not for the brand. Not for the shareholders. Find her because she's your wife, and she is carrying your child. Find her before you lose the last part of your soul." After Ethan left, the silence of the penthouse pressed in on Dominic, heavier than before. He was haunted. Not by guilt, that was an emotion he rarely accessed, but by the memory of the look in Nina's eyes. It wasn't just fear or desperation. It was recognition. She had seen him, and in that same instant, she had seen through him. She had seen the calculation, the cowardice. He walked to his bar and poured a glass of expensive scotch, the amber liquid doing nothing to warm the chill inside him. Ethan was wrong. He wasn't losing his soul. He was just protecting his empire. That's what a king had to do. Sacrifices were necessary. But as he stared at his reflection in the dark window, a face he barely recognized, gaunt with stress, he couldn't shake the feeling that the sacrifice he'd made on that sun-drenched street hadn't been Nina. It had been himself. The crack in the marble was spreading. A week later, the first tremor hit. It started not as an earthquake, but as a faint whisper on a niche gossip blog. The post was titled, "Chicago's King Vale, an Empty Castle." It was speculative, filled with innuendo about Nina Vale's conspicuous absence from the social scene. It mentioned that sources close to the couple hadn't seen her in months, and that Dominic's team was being evasively tight-lipped. The post was accompanied by a grainy, long-lens photo of Dominic getting into his Bentley. In the background, blurry but unmistakable, was the figure of a pregnant woman on the ground, a small crowd gathering around her. The caption read, "Is this a coincidence or a sign of trouble in paradise? One thing's for sure, where there's smoke, there's usually a billion-dollar fire." Dominic's PR head, a ruthless woman named Miranda, was in his office within the hour, tablet in hand. "This is a brush fire, Dominic. We need to kill it before it becomes an inferno. Issue a denial. A statement about privacy, Dominic said, his eyes fixed on the blurry image of Nina. He could almost feel the heat from the pavement. With what? They'll ask where she is. We've been peddling the European villa story for 2 months. It won't hold up to real scrutiny, Miranda said, her tone clinical. We need her. We need a photo op. You, her belly, smiling. We need to control the narrative, and right now, we have no narrative. The word control jolted him. He was losing it. The situation was spiraling, becoming a public spectacle. The one thing he abhorred. Find her, he ordered, the words tasting like ash. It was the same command his brother had given him, but the motive was entirely different. Ethan had wanted him to find his wife. Dominic wanted to find his asset. I've already engaged a private investigator, Miranda said, anticipating him. The best, a discreet firm. They'll need a recent photo, personal details, known associates. The search began. Dominic, the man who could track global financial markets to the second, was now using his immense resources to hunt for his own wife. The irony was lost on him, buried under a mountain of anxiety. The investigators were professionals, feeding him sterile updates. Possible lead in the Wicker Park area. Interviewing a friend named Jade Ramsey. She's not cooperating. Meanwhile, the story grew. The initial blog post was picked up by more reputable online magazines. The blurry photo was sharpened by digital experts. The narrative began to solidify. Dominic Vale, the powerful tycoon, and his mysteriously vanished pregnant wife. In the bookstore, Zoe slid her phone across the counter to Nina. Hey, isn't this that big-shot developer? The guy who owns half the city? Nina looked down. Her own face, pixelated and indistinct, stared back at her from the news article. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were looking for her. Not him. Not Dominic, the man who loved her. But them. His team. The machine. She wasn't a person to be found, but a problem to be solved. A PR crisis to be managed. Panic, cold and suffocating, seized her. This little world she had built, this fragile piece, was about to be shattered. He would find her, drag her back into the spotlight, and parade her around to save his reputation. Her child would be born into that circus. That evening, Jade showed up at her apartment, her face grim. They came to my office, Nina. 2 men in suits, PIs, asking questions about you. I told them to get lost and called my lawyer, but they're sniffing around. It's only a matter of time. Nina wrapped her arms around her stomach, a primal need to protect her baby overwhelming her. What do I do, Jade? I can't go back. I won't. You're not going back, Jade said fiercely. But you can't hide forever. He's using his money to corner you. The only way to beat a bully with power is to take the power away from him. How? Nina whispered, her voice trembling. You stop hiding, Jade said, her eyes meeting Nina's. You get in front of the story. You tell it yourself. Your own words. Your own truth. You think he's controlling the narrative? Rip it out of his hands. The idea was terrifying. It meant stepping into the light she'd been so desperate to avoid. It meant confronting him, not as a runaway wife, but as his equal. It meant fighting. For the first time, Nina considered it. The fear was still there, but beneath it, the hard, cold ember of survival that had been forged on that sidewalk began to glow. He had left her on the ground. Maybe it was time she got up and showed him she could stand on her own. The investigator was good. It wasn't a dramatic showdown, but a quiet, mundane discovery. He simply followed the trail of kindness Nina had left in her wake. A tip from a pharmacist, where she'd filled a prescription for prenatal vitamins. A confirmation from a grocer, who remembered the polite, pregnant woman who always paid in cash. The trail led directly to Ben's cafe. Dominic arrived on a grey, overcast afternoon. He didn't come in his Bentley, but in a nondescript black sedan. He wore a simple dark sweater and trousers, an attempt at looking unassuming that failed utterly. His aura of wealth and power was a physical presence, sucking the air out of the cozy cafe the moment he stepped inside. Nina was wiping down a table, her back to the door. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of late pregnancy. Ben was behind the counter, polishing a glass. He saw Dominic first, and his friendly demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a wary stillness. The tension in the room was what made Nina turn, and there he was. For a moment, they just stared at each other, across the small room. The patrons faded away. The clatter of cutlery and the hiss of the espresso machine disappeared. It was just the two of them, a universe of unspoken words and betrayals stretching between them. He looked tired, she noticed, a detail that surprised her. The ironclad composure was still there, but there were fine lines of strain around his eyes she'd never seen before. He took a step forward. "Nina," his voice, the one that used to command boardrooms and charm investors, sounded hollow in the warm, coffee-scented air. Nina placed a hand on her belly, a gesture that was both protective and defiant. She straightened up, her spine stiff. The scared, fleeing woman was gone. A mother stood in her place. "Dominic, you shouldn't be here. We need to talk," he said, his gaze flicking around the cafe with distaste. "Not here. Let's go somewhere private." "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was made of steel. "I like it here. These are my friends." She glanced at Ben, who was now standing with his arms crossed, a silent, unmovable sentinel. Dominic's facade began to crack. A flicker of frustration crossed his face. "Don't be ridiculous. You're creating a media storm. Your picture is everywhere. You need to come home." "Home?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "You mean the 85th floor, the display case? That's not a home, Dominic. It's a showroom, and I am not one of your exhibits. I'll give you anything you want," he said, lowering his voice, trying to regain control. It was a negotiation. A new apartment, a bigger allowance, whatever it takes to fix this, and that was it. The final, clarifying moment. He wasn't here for her. He wasn't here because he was worried or because he missed her. He was here to fix this, to manage the problem. "You want to fix this?" she said, her voice rising slightly, infused with a pain so deep it sounded like anger. "Let's talk about fixing this. Where were you, Dominic, when I was on the sidewalk? When I fainted 100 feet from your car? I saw you. You saw me." The accusation hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Dominic flinched as if struck. The color drained from his face. For the first time, he looked truly cornered, stripped of his power. The Takadas were in the car," he stammered, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. It was a critical moment. It was complicated. Complicated? Nina's voice trembled with a righteous fury she didn't know she possessed. "No, it was simple. You saw your pregnant wife collapse on the street, and you chose to protect a business deal. You chose to protect your image. You left me there. Strangers helped me, Dominic. Strangers. A man who owns the small cafe you're standing in called an ambulance for me. A man who has nothing showed more humanity in 5 minutes than you have shown me in 2 years." Ben took a half step forward, not aggressively, but simply to stand nearer to her, a quiet show of solidarity. Dominic looked from Nina's fierce, tear-streaked face to Ben's steady gaze. In that moment, he saw the chasm between his world and hers. He dealt in billions of dollars, in leverage and contracts. This man dealt in coffee and kindness. And right now, in this small, insignificant cafe, Ben was the richer man. Dominic was bankrupt, He had come here with a strategy, with talking points prepared by his PR team. He was supposed to be conciliatory but firm, to bring her back into the fold. But her words, her truth, had shattered his defenses. There was nothing he could offer her. Money couldn't buy what he had destroyed. An apology couldn't undo the image of his car driving away. Defeated, he turned without another word and walked out of the cafe. He didn't look back. As he stepped into the grey afternoon, the door swinging shut behind him, he felt a profound and unfamiliar emptiness. It wasn't the sting of a failed negotiation. It was the agony of a wound he had inflicted upon himself. He hadn't just lost an argument. He had lost her. And in the chilling silence of his own heart, he was beginning to understand that he may have lost everything that ever truly mattered. The confrontation in the cafe was the first domino. The rest of Dominic's empire began to fall with breathtaking speed. 2 days later, Dominic received a terse, formal email from Mr. Takada's office. They were pulling out of the lakefront development deal. The official reason cited was unforeseen shifts in market confidence. But the personal note attached from Mr. Takada himself was the real blow. It was short and brutal. Mr. Vale, a man who cannot honor his family, cannot be trusted to honor a contract. The foundation of a skyscraper is paramount, but the foundation of a man's character is more so. We have found yours to be unstable. The $2 billion deal, the pinnacle of his career, evaporated. Just like that. The news hit the financial wires an hour later. Vale Industries' stock plummeted 17% by the closing bell. The board of directors, once his loyal sycophants, called for an emergency meeting. They smelled blood in the water. His blood. He sat in the boardroom, the same room where he had commanded with absolute authority, and felt like a stranger. The faces looking back at him were filled with accusation and fear. They weren't just questioning his handling of the PR crisis. They were questioning his judgment, his stability, his very identity as a leader. His brother Ethan was there, representing the family's stake. He remained silent through most of the proceedings, his expression grim. As the meeting adjourned with a vote to form a special committee to oversee Mr. Vale's executive decisions, effectively stripping him of his autonomy, Ethan walked with him to the elevator. "They're circling," Dominic said, his voice hollow. "What did you expect?" Ethan replied, his voice devoid of triumph, only a deep, resounding sadness. "You build an empire on an image of strength and control. The moment that image cracks, the whole thing comes down. You did this, Dominic, every step of the way. When you isolated Nina, when you drove her away, when you left her on that sidewalk, you laid the dynamite, and your own arrogance lit the fuse." Dominic had no response. The fight was gone. The defensive anger had been replaced by a vast, echoing numbness. That night, he walked through the penthouse. The cleaning staff had been, but it felt derelict. It was a mausoleum of his success. Trophies and awards gleamed on shelves, testaments to deals he had won and rivals he had crushed. He picked up a heavy crystal obelisk, the Developer of the Year award. It felt weightless, meaningless. He stood before the great window, looking down at the city he had sought to conquer. It looked alien to him now, a web of lights connecting people he didn't know, filled with a life he couldn't access. His world had been the view from the top. He'd never considered the lives on the streets below, unless they were in the way of a new development. The image of Nina on the pavement returned to him, but this time it was different. He didn't see it from the detached safety of his Bentley. He felt the jarring impact of her body on the concrete. He felt the searing heat, the blinding sun. He felt the panic of a pregnant woman, alone and terrified, as the world went black. For the first time, he felt her pain, not his inconvenience. A sob, raw and ugly, tore from his throat. It was a sound he hadn't made since he was a child. He sank to the cold marble floor, the crystal award slipping from his grasp and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The sound echoed the breaking of his own hubris. He had lost the deal. He had lost control of his company. He had lost his brother's respect. And he had lost his wife. He had meticulously built a kingdom of glass and steel, only to discover he was its sole, miserable prisoner. Rock bottom wasn't a financial figure, it was this profound, crushing isolation, born entirely from his own choices. The reckoning had come, and in the ruins of his perfect life, Dominic Vale finally began to weep. 3 months passed. The Chicago autumn arrived, painting the city in hues of amber and rust. The media frenzy surrounding the Vales had died down, replaced by newer, more sensational stories. Nina gave birth to a healthy baby girl on a crisp October morning. She named her Lily. Lily Ellis. Holding her daughter for the first time, Nina felt a love so fierce and absolute it recalibrated her entire world. Every hardship, every moment of fear had led her to this small, perfect miracle. Her life wasn't defined by what she had run from anymore, but by the tiny, trusting hand wrapped around her finger. Her life in Wicker Park had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Her apartment was crowded with baby things, most of them second-hand gifts from her new community. Helen from the bookstore was a doting honorary grandmother. Jade was the ever-present cool aunt. And Ben. Ben was simply a friend, a good, steady friend who would drop off soup when he knew she was too tired to cook and who could make Lily giggle like no one else. There was an unspoken warmth between them, a gentle possibility that neither was in a hurry to define. For now, friendship was more than enough. She never heard from Dominic. After the news of his professional downfall broke, a part of her had expected him to make one last, desperate attempt to reclaim his life, with her in it. But there was only silence. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived. It wasn't from a courier, but sent by certified mail. It was a thick, simple manila envelope with a handwritten address. She recognized the sharp, decisive penmanship instantly. Her heart stuttered. With trembling hands, she put Lily down in her bassinet and opened it. Inside were 2 things, a sheaf of legal documents and a single handwritten letter. She read the letter first. Nina, there are no words to properly express the depth of my regret. An apology from me has no value, as I have proven my words to be worthless. I know that now. I don't write this letter to ask for your forgiveness, as I know I haven't earned it and may never earn it. I write it only to offer an explanation, not an excuse. My entire life has been a construction, built to project strength and hide a deep-seated fear of failure. I saw people, including you, as parts of that construction. I valued you, not for who you were, but for how you reflected on me. It was a profound and unforgivable moral failure. The day I saw you on the street, I made a choice born of that cowardice. In choosing my image, I destroyed my reality. I see that now. Losing everything, the deal, the company's reputation, you, was not a tragedy. It was a consequence, a necessary one. I have been in therapy. I have stepped down as CEO of Vale Industries. I am trying to learn how to be a man, not a brand. The enclosed documents are for our daughter. I have established an irrevocable trust in her name. The funds are substantial enough that she will never have to worry about anything. Crucially, I am not the trustee. Your friend, Jade Ramsey, and my brother, Ethan, have agreed to act as co-trustees, and they alone will manage it until she is of age. I have no access and no control. This is not a tool for leverage. It is not a gift to you. It is the one thing I can give our daughter that is clean of my influence. It is a chance for her future, a future I hope you will build for her, far away from the life I would have given her. I will not contact you again. I will not interfere in your life or hers. My only hope is that one day she will know she has a father who, having failed her completely, is at least trying to become a man worthy of her existence. He is just not there yet. Dominic. Nina read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the ink. It was not the letter of the man she had married. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a brutal, unflinching self-awareness. It was the sound of a man who had walked through fire and been irrevocably changed by the flames. She looked at the legal documents, saw the signatures of Jade and Ethan, and understood. This was not a ploy. This was an act of surrender, an act of penance. He was giving her the one thing she had fought so hard to win: complete freedom. Forgiveness was a distant, hazy shoreline she couldn't yet see. The wounds were too deep. But for the first time, the hard knot of anger and betrayal in her chest began to loosen. She looked over at her daughter, sleeping peacefully, bathed in the soft afternoon light. Lily's future was secure, protected not by Dominic's power, but by his absence. Nina folded the letter and placed it in a small wooden box with her most treasured keepsakes. The future was still an unwritten page. Perhaps one day, a different version of Dominic would be a part of it, in some small way. Perhaps not. But as she picked up her daughter and held her close, breathing in her sweet, milky scent, Nina knew one thing for certain. Her new beginning was finally, truly hers. What a journey. We've seen Nina's incredible transformation from a trophy wife in a gilded cage to a fierce, independent mother who found richness not in wealth, but in community and love. We witnessed Dominic Vale, a man at the pinnacle of power, make a single, heartless decision that caused his entire empire and his soul to shatter. His path to redemption is long and uncertain, but it begins with a single, selfless act. Their story reminds us that true strength isn't about control, but courage, and that true wealth isn't what you own, but what you're willing to sacrifice for what you love. Can a man who has caused so much pain truly change? Can betrayal on that level ever be forgiven? We'd love to hear what you think. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up, share it with a friend, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional and dramatic real-life stories. Thank you for watching.
The pristine white of the hospital room was a canvas for a masterpiece of horror. Isabella's world, once painted in the vibrant hues of love and luxury, had been violently slashed to ribbons of black and blue. The steady, rhythmic beep of the fetal heart monitor was a cruel metronome counting down the seconds of her nightmare. Her husband, Richard, the man who had promised to cherish her, stood over her, his handsome face contorted into a mask of rage. It wasn't the first time, but it was the worst. And as his hand rose again, she knew with a chilling certainty that this was not just about them anymore. This was about the life inside her. The penthouse was an aquarium, and Isabella Rossi Blackwood was its most prized exotic fish. Perched 50 stories above the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view that could steal one's breath. But for Isabella, they were just glass walls. She had everything a woman could supposedly want. A wardrobe filled with clothes she rarely had occasion to wear, jewelry that lay cold and dormant in velvet boxes, and a husband whose name was synonymous with power and success. Richard Blackwood hadn't just climbed the corporate ladder, he had built the ladder, then sold it for a fortune. Their love story had started like a modern fairy tale. She was a promising art curator, passionate and full of life, with a modest gallery inheritance to her name. He was the charismatic tech mogul who had swept her off her feet with whirlwind dates in Paris and promises of a life less ordinary. He had loved her fire, he'd said, her independence. But over the 3 years of their marriage, he had methodically, lovingly extinguished it. It started subtly, a suggestion that her job was too stressful for her. "Let me take care of you, Bella," he'd murmured, his voice like warm honey. "You've worked so hard, it's my turn to pamper you." So she'd given up the gallery. Then it was her friends. They were too loud, too unsophisticated for the circles they now moved in. Her weekly painting class was a childish hobby that took up time she could be using to plan his charity galas. Each concession was a golden thread in the tapestry of her gilded cage, woven with such care that she hadn't realized she was trapped until the door was already locked. Now 7 months pregnant, the cage felt smaller than ever. The baby, a little girl she had already named Sophia in her heart, was both her greatest joy and her deepest fear. Sophia was a reason to fight, but she was also a new vulnerability, another person for Richard to control. The evening air was thick with the scent of an impending storm, mirroring the tempest brewing within the silent, cavernous apartment. Richard was late. He was always late now. Isabella stood before a large abstract canvas in what was once her studio and was now designated the sitting room. Her hand rested protectively on the swell of her belly, a gesture that had become second nature. The painting was a chaotic swirl of deep blues and violent reds, a stark contrast to the serene landscapes she used to create. It was a portrait of her marriage, a silent scream she couldn't voice. The click of the key in the front door sent a jolt through her. She quickly smoothed down her silk maternity dress and forced a smile onto her face. It was a familiar, well-practiced performance. Richard strode in, shedding his tailored Italian coat and tossing it onto a minimalist chair. He didn't look at her, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on his phone. "Dinner?" he asked, his voice clipped. "It's ready, darling. I kept it warm," she said, her voice soft, careful. "I made your favorite osso buco." He finally looked up, and his gaze was like ice. "I ate at the club. Closed the Henderson deal." "Oh, that's wonderful, Richard." Disappointment, sharp and familiar, pricked at her. She had spent hours preparing the meal, her swollen ankles aching as she'd stood in the state-of-the-art kitchen. "It would have been closed 3 hours ago if my team wasn't composed of incompetent children," he snapped, loosening his tie. He walked to the wet bar and poured himself a generous measure of scotch. "And my wife, who was supposed to confirm my dinner reservation with Henderson for tomorrow, apparently forgot." Isabella's blood ran cold. The reservation. With the doctor's appointment this morning and her exhaustion, it had completely slipped her mind. "Richard, I am so sorry. The baby was kicking so much and I got distracted. I'll call them right now." He took a long swallow of his drink before turning to face her fully. The faint scent of expensive alcohol and a cloying, unfamiliar perfume reached her. "You have one job, Isabella. One. To manage this house. To manage my schedule. And you can't even do that." He took a step closer, his 6'3" frame towering over her. "What exactly do you do all day? Stare out the window? Splash paint around?" He gestured dismissively at her canvas. "What is that garbage anyway?" Tears welled in her eyes, hot and shameful. "Don't call it garbage. I'll call it what it is. It's ugly. It's a mess. Just like you're becoming." The words were deliberate, each one a perfectly aimed dart. He was a master of psychological warfare. He knew her insecurities, her deepest fears, and he wielded them like weapons. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her gaze falling to the floor. It was always easier to apologize. Sorry doesn't fix it. Sorry doesn't make me look competent in front of my clients. He finished his scotch and slammed the glass down on the marble countertop. The sound echoed in the silent room. "I need you to be perfect, Bella. Is that too much to ask? I give you this life, this palace. All I ask for is perfection." He moved toward the bedroom, his anger seeming to dissipate as quickly as it had arrived, leaving a chilling vacuum in its wake. This was his pattern. The storm, then the unnerving calm. She was left to pick up the pieces of her own shattered nerves. She stood frozen for a long moment, her hand pressed against her stomach, as Sophia gave a small, fluttering kick, as if in response to her mother's distress. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the back of the sofa to steady herself, a sharp, sudden pain radiating from her lower back. She gasped, her knuckles turning white. It was probably just a Braxton Hicks contraction, the doctor had said to expect them. But this felt different. It was sharp, insistent. Another followed, stronger this time, stealing her breath. A dark premonition crept into her heart. Something was wrong. "Richard," she called out, her voice trembling. "Richard, I think you need to take me to the hospital." The drive to the hospital was a blur of city lights smeared by the rain that had finally broken. Richard drove with a terrifying, controlled speed, his silence more menacing than any tirade. Isabella sat huddled in the passenger seat of the Bentley, one hand clutching the door handle, the other protectively cradling her belly. The pains were coming faster now, sharp and rhythmic, a cruel drumbeat of fear against her ribs. She tried to focus on her breathing, on the calming techniques from her prenatal yoga class. But the air in the car was thick with Richard's barely contained fury. He wasn't worried. He was inconvenienced. When they arrived at the private maternity wing of St. Jude's, a place he had chosen, of course, for its exclusivity and reputation, the sterile, quiet opulence did nothing to soothe her. It felt cold, impersonal. A nurse with a practiced, gentle smile settled her into a private suite that looked more like a luxury hotel room than a hospital room, with its muted gray walls, abstract art, and a stunning view of the rain-lashed city. A young, kind-faced doctor named Sarah Jenkins examined her. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but professional, "it seems you're in preterm labor. We're going to do everything we can to stop the contractions, but we need to be prepared. We'll start you on a magnesium sulfate drip. It should help relax the uterus." The word sent a fresh wave of panic through Isabella. Preterm labor. It was too soon. Sophia wasn't ready. Richard stood by the window, his back to them, looking out at the city as if the drama unfolding behind him was a tedious play he was being forced to watch. "Is the baby okay?" Isabella asked, her voice a raw whisper. "Her heartbeat is strong and steady," Dr. Jenkins reassured her, offering a small smile. "That's a very good sign. For now, we just need you to rest and let the medication do its work." As the nurse hooked up the IV, the magnesium sulfate began to drip into her veins, making her feel flushed and strangely heavy, as if her limbs were made of lead. The contractions began to ease slightly, their sharp peaks softening into dull, rolling aches. Dr. Jenkins and the nurse left, promising to check on her frequently. The silence that descended on the room was deafening. The only sounds were the soft beep of the heart monitor and the drumming of the rain against the window. "Preterm labor," Richard finally said, turning from the window. His face was unreadable, his voice devoid of emotion. "Another thing to go wrong. Did you do something you weren't supposed to? Lift something? Stress yourself out over that ridiculous painting?" Isabella stared at him, bewildered. The accusation, so callous and immediate, was breathtaking. "No, Richard, of course not. The doctor said this sometimes just happens. With you, things always just happen," he sneered, walking slowly towards the bed. "Dropped wine on the new rug. A fender bender in my car. Now you can't even carry our child properly. It's a pattern of incompetence, Isabella." Her heart, already pounding with fear for her baby, now hammered with a different kind of terror. The look in his eyes was one she knew all too well. It was the look he got before the carefully constructed facade of the perfect husband crumbled, revealing the monster beneath. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "Not now. Please, don't do this here." The medication made her feel weak, defenseless. She was tethered to the bed by tubes, a prisoner in a white-walled cage. "Don't do what?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He stopped at the foot of her bed. "Don't point out the truth. You're so fragile. I provide you with a stress-free life, the best doctors, the best food, and you still manage to fail. This isn't a failure. This is our daughter, Richard. She needs us to be calm. She needs a mother who isn't a weak, hysterical mess," he shot back. He moved closer, his shadow falling over her. She could smell the scotch on his breath again. He must have had a flask in his coat. Everything was perfect. The Henderson deal, the new acquisition, everything was lining up. And you have to ruin it with this drama. He reached out and grabbed the chart hanging from the foot of the bed, his knuckles white. He scanned it, his lip curling in a sneer. Magnesium sulfate. Pathetic. He tossed the chart onto the chair, the clatter making her flinch. Richard, stop it. You're scaring me. Am I? He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You know what's scary, Bella? The thought of my child being raised by someone as incompetent as you, the thought of my name, my legacy, being tied to your constant failures. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. She turned her head away, looking towards the door, praying for a nurse to walk in. But the hallway was silent. Her movement, her silent rejection of him, seemed to flick a switch. The last vestige of his control snapped. His hand shot out and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His grip was like steel. Don't you dare turn away from me, he hissed, his face inches from hers. When I am talking to you, you look at me. A sharp pain shot through her jaw. You're hurting me, she whimpered. The beep of the fetal monitor suddenly sped up, a frantic, high-pitched rhythm that echoed her own terror. Richard's eyes darted to the machine, and a flicker of something, annoyance, not concern, crossed his face. Look what you're doing, he snarled, as if the baby's distress was her fault. You're upsetting her. He let go of her chin, and for a terrifying second she thought he was done. But then his hand drew back. She saw it as if in slow motion, the expensive watch on his wrist, the cufflinks glinting in the dim light. She tried to raise her arms to protect her face, but the IV line pulled taut, and her limbs felt sluggish, uncooperative. The slap was deafening in the quiet room. Her head snapped to the side, and a blinding, white-hot pain exploded across her cheek. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. The shock was so profound, so absolute, that for a moment she couldn't even breathe. He had been cruel before. He had pushed her, grabbed her too hard, but he had never, ever hit her in the face. She lay there stunned and trembling, her cheek throbbing in time with the frantic beeping of the monitor. A low, guttural sob escaped her lips. Richard stood over her, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. He looked down at his own hand as if it were a foreign object. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of what looked like regret crossed his face. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold, defensive fury. You made me do that, he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that was all the more terrifying for its quiet intensity. You pushed me. He was turning to say more when the door to the suite opened. Standing in the doorway was her father, Michael Rossi. He was holding a small bouquet of flowers and a teddy bear. His face, usually so warm and gentle, was frozen. His eyes took in the scene in an instant. Isabella, crying, holding a hand to her face, the frantic beeping of the monitor, and Richard standing over her like a predator. The flowers and the teddy bear fell from his slackened grip, hitting the polished floor with a soft, sickening thud. Michael Rossi was a man who had built a life and a small fortune on a foundation of patience and concrete. In his years running a successful construction company, he had learned that the most formidable structures weren't built with hasty anger, but with meticulous planning and unshakable resolve. He was 65, with hands calloused from work he hadn't needed to do himself for 30 years, and a calm, steady gaze that had unnerved union bosses and city inspectors alike. To Richard Blackwood, he was just a simple, retired contractor, a doting, slightly old-fashioned father from a bygone era. Richard had never bothered to look any deeper. That was his first and last mistake. The tableau Michael walked in on seared itself into his memory. The clinical smell of the hospital, the insistent, panicked rhythm of the heart monitor, the sight of his daughter, his only child, the center of his world, cradling her face while her husband loomed over her, and the look in Richard's eyes. It was not the look of a concerned husband. It was the possessive, contemptuous glare of an owner whose property had just misbehaved. For one single white-hot second, Michael Rossi felt a primal urge he hadn't experienced since he was a young man in a much rougher, more dangerous business, an urge to cross the room in 3 strides and tear Richard Blackwood apart with his bare hands. He could feel the phantom sensation of bone giving way beneath his knuckles. But then decades of discipline slammed down like a steel gate. Rage was a wildfire, destructive and uncontrollable. What was needed now was ice, cold, precise, and utterly relentless. His face, which had been frozen in shock, settled into an unnerving calm. He met Richard's startled, arrogant gaze, and his own eyes became flat, dark, and hard as granite. He said nothing. He simply held Richard's stare, letting the silence stretch until it was a tangible, suffocating thing. Richard, recovering his composure, was the first to break. He straightened his suit jacket, the picture of aggrieved authority. "Michael, I wasn't expecting you. Isabella and I were just having a private moment. She's overly emotional." Michael's gaze didn't waver. He took one slow, deliberate step into the room, his eyes still locked on Richard. He didn't even glance at Isabella, though every fiber of his being screamed to rush to her side. He knew the first step was to remove the threat. "Get out," Michael said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, gravelly rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very foundation of the earth. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. Richard scoffed, a flicker of disbelief crossing his face. "Excuse me? This is my wife's room. I'm not going anywhere." Michael took another step. "You're going to turn around, walk out that door, and you are not going to see or speak to my daughter again. Not without my permission, which you will never have." A surge of anger and arrogance flooded Richard's features. Who was this old man to command him? "You have no idea who you're talking to," Richard snarled, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of dominance. "I'll have security escort you out." Michael allowed a small, cold smile to touch his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Try it." He took his phone from his pocket, his movements unhurried. He dialed a single number. He didn't take his eyes off Richard. "Tony," he said into the phone, his voice calm. "I'm at St. Jude's maternity wing, suite 412. Yes, there's a man here who is about to be asked to leave. His name is Richard Blackwood. I need you to make sure he understands that he is no longer welcome in this building. And I'd like you to arrange for his visiting privileges to be permanently revoked." He paused, listening. Richard watched, a smirk playing on his lips, assuming this was some pathetic bluff. "No, I don't think he'll be violent," Michael continued into the phone. "He's a coward. But have a couple of your boys meet him at the elevator, just in case. And Tony, call Arthur down at the 19th precinct. Let him know I might need a restraining order expedited in the morning. Tell him it's for Bella. He'll understand." He hung up without saying goodbye. The color drained from Richard's face. He didn't know who Tony was, but he knew who Arthur was. Captain Arthur Finnegan was a man Richard had been trying to get a meeting with for months, a man whose charity board he had desperately wanted to join, a man who apparently took calls from his folksy father-in-law. The quiet, unshakable confidence with which Michael had made the call sent a sliver of ice into Richard's gut. The old man wasn't bluffing. This was not the simple contractor he had patronized at family dinners. "Now," Michael said, pocketing his phone, "I'm going to count to 3. Suddenly, the door opened again, and Dr. Jenkins rushed in, followed by a nurse. Their eyes were on the monitor, which was still beeping frantically. "What's going on in here? Her blood pressure is spiking." Michael finally broke eye contact with Richard and turned to his daughter. The cold mask fell away, replaced by an expression of infinite love and pain. He walked to her bedside, gently taking her hand. It was ice cold. He brushed the hair from her bruised face, his touch feather light. "Daddy," she sobbed, the single word conveying a lifetime of fear and relief. "I'm here, sweet girl. I'm here now," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Dr. Jenkins. "This man," he said, nodding towards Richard, his voice hardening again, "was upsetting my daughter. He needs to leave. Now." Dr. Jenkins looked from Michael's resolute face to Richard's sputtering indignation. "Mr. Blackwood, for the sake of your wife and child, I think it's best if you wait outside." Cornered, humiliated, and for the first time genuinely unnerved, Richard glared at Michael. It was a look of pure, undiluted hatred. He opened his mouth to protest, but then he saw them, 2 large, broad-shouldered men in dark suits, standing silently in the hallway just outside the door. They weren't hospital security. They were perfectly still, their eyes fixed on him. Without another word, Richard turned and strode out of the room, his fists clenched at his sides. Michael watched him go, his expression unreadable. He then turned his full attention back to Isabella. The nurse was adjusting the IV drip, and Dr. Jenkins was speaking to her in low, calming tones. As Isabella's sobs subsided, the frantic beeping of the heart monitor began to slow, returning to a steady, reassuring rhythm. Michael Rossi sat in the chair by his daughter's bed, holding her hand, and began to plan. Richard Blackwood thought this was over. He thought he had lost a brief, humiliating battle of wills. He had no idea that Michael was not interested in winning a battle. Michael Rossi was preparing for a war. He would not rest until he had systematically dismantled Richard Blackwood's life, piece by piece, until nothing was left but dust and regret. He would tear down the gilded cage, and then he would tear down the man who built it. For Richard Blackwood, the world was a chessboard, and he was its grandmaster. People were pawns, assets, or opponents, to be manipulated, acquired, or crushed. His father-in-law, he'd assessed early on, was a harmless piece, a retired bishop confined to a single, unimportant square on the board. He had never imagined the old man was playing an entirely different game, a long, patient game of Go, where a few strategically placed stones could quietly surround and capture the entire board. The unraveling began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, inexplicable tremors that shook the foundations of Richard's empire. The first sign came 2 days after his ejection from the hospital. He was in his office, a monument of glass and steel overlooking the financial district, attempting to salvage the Henderson deal. His apology calls to Henderson had gone unreturned. He was in the middle of dictating a blistering email to his legal team when his CFO, a perpetually nervous man named Greg, appeared at his door, his face the color of ash. "The SEC is here," Greg stammered. "They have a warrant. They're seizing trading records related to the Aerodyne acquisition." Richard went cold. The Aerodyne acquisition, finalized 6 months ago, had been his masterpiece, a hostile takeover that had doubled the value of Blackwood Industries. It had also been fueled by a series of aggressive, borderline legal stock purchases, informed by a very specific, very confidential tip. It was a sealed play, known only to him and his 2 most trusted brokers. An anonymous tip, the SEC agent said, a highly detailed one. Richard spent the rest of the day watching stone-faced agents pack away his company's financial soul into cardboard boxes. The next stone was placed a week later. Richard was a man who lived and died by his reputation. He cultivated an image of a ruthless but brilliant innovator and a dedicated philanthropist. He sat on the board of the Children's Health Foundation, a position he'd secured with a 7-figure donation. It was the crown jewel of his public persona. He received a call from the board's chairman, a stern, old-money patriarch named Charles Hemingsworth. "Richard," Hemingsworth said, his voice dripping with disapproval, "we're calling an emergency meeting of the board this afternoon. In light of certain disturbing allegations that have come to our attention, we feel it's best if you tender your resignation immediately." "What allegations?" Richard demanded, his voice rising. "This is slander. Who is making these claims?" "My source is unimpeachable," Hemingsworth replied coolly. "He also happens to be a founding member of this foundation, though he has preferred to remain anonymous for years. He made it quite clear that either you go or he withdraws his family's endowment. That's a $30 million endowment, Richard. The choice is yours, but I suggest you don't make us choose for you." The line went dead. The source, Richard knew in his gut, had to be Michael. But how? How did a retired contractor have the ear of Charles Hemingsworth? Meanwhile, Michael Rossi sat not in an office, but at the simple oak table in his suburban home. The house was comfortable, unpretentious, the kind of place Richard would have sneered at. In front of him was not a computer, but an old leather-bound address book, its pages filled with names written in his neat, block handwriting. These were the stones for his game, men he had worked with, done favors for, and built relationships with over 40 years. Men who owed him. Tony, the man from the hospital, was Antonio "Tony the Bull" Moretti. Before he owned the city's most high-tech and discreet private security firm, he had been a hot-headed kid from Michael's old neighborhood. Michael had taken him under his wing, given him a job on a construction site, and later co-signed the loan for his first business venture. Tony's loyalty was absolute. The unimpeachable source who spoke to Hemingsworth was Michael's oldest friend, a quiet, unassuming man named Ben. Ben's father had started the Children's Health Foundation 50 years ago. Michael and Ben had grown up together, their bond forged long before money and power entered the picture. All it took was one phone call. "Benny, it's me. I need to ask you for something. It's about Bella." The next attack came from the press. Richard had carefully curated his relationship with the media, using a high-powered PR firm to plant stories of his genius and generosity. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. A tenacious investigative journalist from a major financial paper published a scathing expose on the working conditions at one of Blackwood Industries' offshore manufacturing plants. The story was filled with damning, on-the-record quotes from disgruntled former employees, details of safety violations, and evidence of falsified compliance reports. Documents Richard had believed were buried forever. The journalist had gotten her tip from a woman named Maria. 20 years ago, Maria had been Michael Rossi's bookkeeper. Now her son, a brilliant but struggling lawyer, ran a small firm specializing in labor rights. Michael had called Maria, and Maria had called her son. Michael had paid all the legal fees and provided protection for the whistleblowers. Richard was hemorrhaging money and respect. His stock price plummeted. His allies in the business world grew distant. Their calls suddenly harder to connect. The whispers at the club, the sideways glances at cocktail parties. He could feel the walls of his kingdom crumbling. He was trapped in a nightmare of 1,000 cuts, unable to identify the hand that held the knife, even though he knew. He just couldn't comprehend the how. He had underestimated the simple power of a lifetime of loyalty, of favors given without expectation of return, of friendships that ran deeper than any bank account. While Richard's world burned, Isabella's was being quietly rebuilt. Michael had moved her into his home as soon as the doctors gave the all clear. The magnesium drip had worked, stopping the labor. She was on strict bed rest, but for the first time in years, she felt safe. The house was filled with the scent of her mother's old rose garden and the sound of wind chimes on the porch. Her father brought her meals, read to her, and simply sat with her, his quiet presence a balm on her raw nerves. He never spoke of what he was doing to Richard. He didn't need to. Isabella saw it in the grim set of his jaw when he took a call in the other room, in the exhaustion that sometimes shadowed his eyes. One evening, as he fluffed her pillows, she reached out and took his hand. "Daddy," she said softly, "be careful." He looked at her, his eyes full of a fierce, protective love. "The only thing I was ever careless about, Bella, was you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I was so proud of you, so happy you'd found this successful, charming man, that I stopped looking. I didn't see the cage he was building around you. I will never make that mistake again." He squeezed her hand. "He built his world on money and fear. That's just sand and smoke. I'm just showing him what a real foundation looks like." Richard Blackwood had always believed that power was a fortress. Its walls were built of money, its moats filled with influence, and its gates guarded by fear. For years he had reigned from within, untouchable. He had never considered that a fortress could be dismantled from the inside out, its foundations methodically turned to dust by an enemy who refused to play by his rules. The downfall was not a sudden, dramatic collapse, but a slow, agonizing slide into oblivion. It was the death of 1,000 cuts, each one small and seemingly insignificant, yet collectively fatal. After the SEC raid and his ousting from the charity board, a palpable sense of paranoia began to seep into the cracks of his composure. The world, once his oyster, now felt hostile, lined with hidden barbs. He sat in his penthouse, the scene of his last assault on Isabella, but the space no longer felt like a symbol of his power. It felt like a tomb. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the climate control system. He hadn't seen Isabella since that day at the hospital. His calls went to a disconnected number. His texts were unanswered. His lawyers had been met with a wall of steel in the form of a top-tier divorce attorney, a man far too expensive for a simple contractor to afford, who served him with a restraining order and divorce papers that cited, in excruciating detail, his history of abuse. He drank. The expensive scotch that had once been a symbol of celebration now tasted like ash. He'd paced the vast empty rooms, his mind racing, trying to strategize his way out of a war he didn't understand. He threw money at the problem, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on Michael Rossi. They came back with nothing. The man's record was clean, his business dealings legitimate, his taxes paid. He was a ghost, a phantom, orchestrating Richard's ruin from the shadows. His business, his pride and joy, was bleeding. The expose had triggered not only a stock collapse but a series of boycotts and canceled contracts. Key employees, smelling blood in the water, began to jump ship, taking valuable trade secrets with them. His CFO, Greg, resigned via a two-line email, citing ethical concerns. The Henderson deal, once a sure thing, was now a distant memory. Henderson had signed with a competitor. The psychological toll was immense. Richard, a man who thrived on control, was experiencing the terrifying freefall of losing it completely. He started seeing conspiracies everywhere. The barista who spelled his name wrong on his coffee cup was mocking him. The doorman's polite greeting felt laced with pity. He became a prisoner in his own home, the floor-to-ceiling windows now showcasing a city that had turned its back on him. The final crushing blow came from the one place he thought was secure, his bank. He had built his empire on leverage, on a complex web of loans and lines of credit from a bank where he had a personal, long-standing relationship with the CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne. They played golf together, their wives shopped together. He received a call from Marcus's assistant summoning him to a meeting. Richard put on his best suit, a hollow armor of defiance, and walked into the bank's headquarters expecting to smooth things over, to leverage his personal connection. Marcus Thorne was not in the mood for golf talk. He sat behind a vast mahogany desk, his face grim. Two other stern-faced board members were with him. "Richard," Marcus began, dispensing with any pleasantries, "the board has reviewed your portfolio. In light of the ongoing SEC investigation, the negative press, and the instability of your company's stock, we're calling in your loans. All of them." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. "What? You can't be serious, Marcus. We have an understanding. I'm your biggest client." Marcus slid a folder across the desk. "Our understanding was predicated on your company's continued stability. That is no longer the case. You have 30 days to remit payment in full, $180 million. 30 days? That's impossible," Richard choked out. "You'll ruin me." "You did this to yourself," Marcus said, his voice cold. He leaned forward slightly. "And frankly, Richard, we're not the only ones concerned. I had a visitor this morning, an old friend of my father's, a man my father owed a great deal to. He told me a story about his daughter, about his grandchild. He told me what you did to her in the hospital." Richard stared at him, his mouth agape. "Michael Rossi, of course." Marcus's eyes hardened. "My father came to this country with nothing, Richard. The man who visited me gave him his first job, vouched for him when no one else would. That man was Michael Rossi. He never asked for anything in return, until today. Today he asked me to take a long, hard look at the kind of man I was doing business with." Marcus stood up, a clear dismissal. "The bank's decision is final. I believe we have nothing more to discuss." Richard stumbled out of the bank and onto the bustling street, a ghost in a $1,000 suit. The city noise was a deafening roar. He had lost, completely and utterly. He had been so obsessed with the grand architecture of power that he'd never paid attention to the quiet, unseen network of human connection that truly held the world together. Michael Rossi hadn't beaten him with money or force. He had beaten him with loyalty, with decency, with love. Concepts Richard had long ago dismissed as weaknesses. He looked up at the glittering skyscrapers, the monuments to men like him. They no longer looked like symbols of triumph. They looked like headstones. He was a broken man, stripped not just of his wealth, but of the very identity he had so carefully constructed. He was nothing. And the worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. While the edifice of Richard's life was being systematically demolished, Isabella was quietly laying the foundation for a new one. The initial days at her father's house were a blur of sleep, grief, and fear. She was a ship wrecked on a foreign shore, the violent storm of her marriage having finally tossed her to a place of safety. The bed rest, initially a medical necessity, became a cocoon. In the quiet of her childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded photographs of a smiling girl with paint-stained fingers, she began the painful process of mourning the man she thought she had married and the life she had once believed was perfect. Her father was her anchor. He never pushed her to talk, but he was always there, a steady, reassuring presence. He brought her books, put on old movies they used to watch together, and sometimes he would just sit in the armchair by her window, reading the paper while she slept. His quiet strength gave her permission to be weak, to fall apart in the safety of his love. The first step towards healing was a phone call. Michael had gently suggested she speak to someone, a therapist named Dr. Eris Thorne, a cousin of the banker, a woman renowned for her work with trauma survivors. Isabella had resisted at first, the shame of what she'd endured making it difficult to voice her story. But finally she agreed. Dr. Thorne didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She had a calm, direct manner that cut through Isabella's defenses. Through secure video calls from her bed, Isabella began to unravel the tangled knot of her marriage. For the first time, she said the words out loud. He abused me. She spoke of the subtle manipulations, the gaslighting, the isolation, and finally the physical violence. Each session was exhausting, like lancing a wound, but with each confession, a little of the poison was released. Isabella, Dr. Thorne said one afternoon, victims of this kind of psychological control often lose their sense of self. He spent years defining your reality for you. The task now is to rediscover your own. The words resonated deeply. Richard had hollowed her out, leaving only a beautiful, empty shell. Who was Isabella Rossi without him? The question was terrifying, but also for the first time, exhilarating. As her pregnancy progressed and her body healed, a new fierce resolve began to take root. It was fueled by the tiny, insistent kicks of her daughter. Sophia deserved more than a broken mother. She deserved a warrior. Isabella started to paint again. Her father, without a word, had converted a spare sunroom into a small studio for her, stocking it with the finest canvases and oils. At first, her hands trembled, the creative spark she once had feeling like a distant memory. Her initial canvases were dark and chaotic, much like the ones she'd been working on in the penthouse. They were filled with jagged lines and furious, clashing colors. It was a messy, painful, but necessary exorcism of her trauma. One day, as she stared at another canvas of rage, she felt Sophia give a strong, rolling kick. She looked down at her belly, and a slow smile spread across her face. She picked up a fresh canvas and began to sketch. This time, there were no dark colors. She painted with soft pinks, gentle yellows, and hopeful blues. She painted a nursery, a crib bathed in moonlight, a mobile of tiny smiling stars. She was no longer painting her past. She was painting her future. The legal battle was another mountain to climb. Her lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Catherine, guided her through the process. Reviewing her financial records, Catherine discovered that Richard, in his arrogance, had put nearly all his assets in both their names to project an image of a unified power couple. It was a fatal mistake on his part. Isabella, the woman he had treated as a decorative object, was legally entitled to half of his crumbling empire. "We're not just going for the standard settlement, Isabella," Catherine told her, her eyes glinting with determination. "We are going for everything he took from you. We're going to reclaim your financial independence so that you and your daughter will never have to depend on anyone again." Empowered by Catherine's confidence and her own growing strength, Isabella took an active role in the proceedings. She provided detailed accounts of Richard's financial dealings she'd overheard, memories she had dismissed as unimportant at the time. She was no longer a passive victim in her own life story. She was the author of her next chapter. The day she signed the final divorce papers was a quiet, momentous occasion. She sat at her father's oak table, the same place he had planned Richard's demise, and signed her name, Isabella Rossi, not Blackwood. With a simple stroke of a pen, she severed the final tie to her abuser. A profound sense of lightness washed over her, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That evening, she walked out into the garden, the cool evening air on her face. The first stars were beginning to appear in the twilight sky. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the strong, steady presence of her daughter. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that hospital months ago. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was a wide-open sky. The scars were there. She knew they would always be a part of her, but they were no longer gaping wounds. They were reminders of a battle she had survived. She was Isabella Rossi, a painter, a survivor, a mother, and she was finally, breathtakingly, free. The end came, as it often does, not on a battlefield, but in a quiet, sterile room. It was a lawyer's conference room, a neutral space of polished mahogany and muted gray walls. Richard had been forced into this final meeting by his own legal team, who had made it brutally clear that he had no cards left to play. His assets were frozen, his company was in receivership, and the SEC was preparing to file criminal charges. This was not a negotiation. It was a surrender. He arrived looking like a ghost of his former self. His expensive suit hung on a frame that had lost 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and bloodshot, circled by the dark rings of sleepless nights and too much alcohol. The swagger was gone, replaced by a twitchy, hunted energy. He sat at one end of the long table, a man stranded on a desert island of his own making. Isabella entered the room with her father and her lawyer, Catherine. She had debated for days whether to come, whether she could bear to see him again. But she knew she had to, not for him, but for herself. She needed to face the monster, not in a hospital bed or a luxurious prison, but on her own terms, standing on her own 2 feet. She was 8.5 months pregnant now, radiant and full of life. She wore a simple, elegant blue dress that didn't hide her swollen belly, but celebrated it. Her face was serene, her eyes clear and steady. When her gaze met Richard's across the table, he was the one who flinched and looked away. The power dynamic, the one he had so brutally enforced for years, had irrevocably, completely inverted. The lawyers began their dry recitation of terms and clauses, the legal language a thin veil over the raw human drama. Richard was to sign over a majority of the remaining liquid assets, the penthouse, and relinquish any and all claims to the company he had built. He would be left with a fraction of his former wealth, enough to live on, but not enough to ever wield power again. He was also to have no contact with Isabella or the child ever. A permanent restraining order would be put in place. Richard sat silent through most of it, his hands trembling slightly. But when the lawyer mentioned the finality of the no-contact order, something inside him snapped. "Bella," he said, his voice raspy, ignoring the lawyers. He looked directly at her, his eyes pleading. "Bella, please, not the baby. She's my daughter too. Don't take my daughter away from me." Isabella met his gaze without fear. Her voice when she spoke was calm and clear, without a trace of the tremor he had so often inspired. "She was your daughter, Richard, on the night you put her life in danger because you were inconvenienced. She was your daughter when you hit her mother while she was tethered to a fetal heart monitor. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted another possession, another perfect object to reflect your own glory. But she is not an object. She is a person, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure she is never, ever in the possession of a man like you." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, defeated. He turned his desperate, hating gaze on the man at the end of the table, the man who had been sitting in silent observation, a statue of quiet resolve. Michael Rossi. "You," Richard spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You did this. The old man with his dirty backroom deals. You think you're better than me? You ruined me." Michael had not said a word since entering the room. He now leaned forward slightly, placing his strong, calloused hands on the table. He looked at the broken man across from him, and for the first time he spoke, his voice low and even, but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "I didn't ruin you, Richard. I just held up a mirror. You did the rest yourself. You built a house of cards on a foundation of greed and cruelty, and you were arrogant enough to think a breeze couldn't knock it down." Michael's eyes were like chips of ice. "You talk about my backroom deals. Let me tell you about my deals. The man who froze your accounts? I paid for his father's heart surgery 30 years ago. The journalist who exposed your labor practices? I put her through night school so she could get her degree. The security guards who threw you out of the hospital? I gave them jobs when they were teenagers with nowhere else to go. These aren't deals, Richard. This is a life. It's a network of respect. Something you can't buy and something you will never understand." He stood up, his presence filling the room. "You saw me as a simple old man. You looked at my daughter and saw a pretty accessory. You looked at the world and saw things to be bought and sold. You were blind to everything that mattered. You weren't beaten by some grand conspiracy. You were beaten by a father who loves his daughter." Michael walked around the table and stood behind Isabella, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Sign the papers, Richard. It's the last decision you'll ever get to make in our lives." Richard stared at the documents, his face a mask of anguish and impotent rage. He saw the truth in Michael's words, a truth more damning than any legal judgment. He had lost everything because he had valued nothing. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed his name, the frantic scrawl a pathetic epitaph for a fallen king. As Isabella and her father turned to leave, Richard spoke one last time, his voice a broken whisper. "I loved you, Bella." Isabella paused at the door but didn't turn around. "No, Richard," she said softly, her voice full of a sad, final clarity. "You don't destroy the things you love." Then she walked out of the room and didn't look back, stepping out of the shadow and into the light. The first snow of the season was falling, thick, silent flakes dusting the windows of the sunroom studio. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of linseed oil, turpentine, and something new, baby powder. In the center of the room, bathed in the soft winter light, Isabella Rossi stood before a large canvas. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, a smudge of cerulean blue on her cheek. The painting was a riot of color and life, a portrait of a sprawling, vibrant garden, not unlike the one outside her window, now sleeping under a blanket of white. It was a painting of hope, of life renewed. In the corner of the room, nestled in a bassinet, lay Sophia Rose Rossi, 1 month old, her tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of sleep. She was perfect. She had Isabella's dark, curly hair, and when she was awake, her grandfather's steady, observant eyes. The birth had been calm and blessedly uneventful, a stark contrast to the terror that had preceded it. Holding her daughter for the first time, Isabella had felt a love so fierce, so profound, it seemed to physically rewire her own heart, sealing the cracks of the past with something infinitely stronger. Her father came in, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. He moved with a quietness he had perfected over the last month, ever mindful of the sleeping baby. He handed a mug to Isabella and stood beside her, looking at the canvas. "It's beautiful, Bella," he said, his voice soft. "It's the best thing you've ever done." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a familiar comfort from her childhood. "I feel like I'm seeing in color for the first time in years, Daddy." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the snowfall. The ghosts of the past year were still there, of course. Trauma doesn't simply vanish. It becomes a part of you, a landscape to be navigated. There were days when a loud noise would make her flinch, or a wave of anxiety would wash over her for no reason at all. But now she had tools to fight back. She had her therapy, her art, and the unconditional love of her family. And most importantly, she had Sophia. She had a reason to be brave that was bigger than her fear. "Have you heard anything?" she asked quietly. She didn't have to say his name. Michael took a sip of his tea. His company was dissolved. The penthouse sold at auction to pay off his debts. The SEC trial is next spring. He'll likely do time. He said it all as a simple statement of fact, without triumph or malice. It was just the closing of a chapter. "Do you ever regret it?" Isabella asked, looking into her father's eyes. "What you did?" Michael was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret I didn't see him for what he was sooner. I regret every second of pain he ever caused you." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But do I regret protecting my family? Do I regret tearing down a man who would hurt my daughter and my granddaughter? No, Isabella. I would do it all again. I would burn the world down for you two." The fierce, unwavering conviction in his voice was the sound of true power. Not the hollow, brittle power that Richard had chased, but the enduring strength of a father's love. Later that afternoon, Isabella bundled a sleeping Sophia into a snowsuit and carried her out to the front porch. The world was hushed and white, clean and new, a fresh start. She looked at her daughter's face, so peaceful and innocent, and made a silent promise. She would raise her to be strong, to know her own worth, to recognize the difference between a gilded cage and a true home. She would teach her that love is not about control, but about freedom. And she would show her, through her art and her life, that even after the most brutal of storms, the sun can rise again, and a garden can regrow, more beautiful and vibrant than ever before. The front door opened and her father joined her, wrapping a protective arm around her and the precious bundle she held. Together, the three of them stood on the porch of the house, built on a foundation of love and loyalty, and watched the snow fall, each flake a tiny promise of a new dawn. The journey of Isabella and her father is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unbreakable bond of family. It's a story of rising from the ashes of betrayal, not with vengeance, but with calculated justice and unwavering love. They tore down a false king and in his place built a kingdom of their own, founded on courage and hope. If their story of resilience and redemption moved you, please show your support. Your likes help these stories reach others who may need to hear them. Share this video with someone you think would be inspired, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. By doing so, you become part of our community, ensuring you won't miss another story of survival, strength, and the incredible power of fighting back. Thank you for watching.